teapot rattled as I set it down, trying to hide my trembling hands. My daughter-in-law's father glanced around my modest living room, smirking. "This is cozy," he said, while his wife muttered about how their pantry was bigger than my entire kitchen. My daughter-in-law laughed along, not realizing how the words cut into me like broken glass. The family planning meeting about my grandson's school schedule had turned into a thinly veiled insult session. They sat on my old sofa, looking around like they'd stepped into a museum of poverty. Her mother picked up one of my ceramic figurines with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her perfectly manicured nails. "Well," her father continued, "at least it's manageable for someone your age." The way he said it made my cheeks burn with shame and anger. They thought they were being subtle, but their message was crystal clear. I was just a poor old woman living in a cramped apartment, barely scraping by. I smiled politely and offered them more tea, knowing deep in my heart that they'd regret this day. If only they knew the truth about this cozy little apartment and the building that housed it. My name is Avery Murphy. I'm 68 years old, a retired school teacher, and the widow of a man who knew how to play the long game. People see me as just another elderly woman living alone, but appearances can be deceiving. My husband and I bought this building 40 years ago when it was nearly falling apart. The previous owner was desperate to sell, and we scraped together every penny we had. Back then, this neighborhood was rough around the edges, but we saw potential where others saw problems. We spent decades slowly renovating each floor, doing most of the work ourselves while raising our son. I live in the smallest unit on purpose. It's easier to maintain at my age, and it lets me rent out the larger apartments for steady income. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my daughter-in-law's parents judged my living space, they had no idea I owned every brick and board around them. This cozy apartment was a choice, not a limitation. But some people measure worth by square footage, and they'd already decided I was lacking. They couldn't have been more wrong, but I wasn't ready to enlighten them just yet. As the conversation continued, they began hinting that my grandson might be better off spending more time at their bigger, more comfortable home. They bragged about their vacation property in the mountains and how their other grandchildren had proper space to play and grow. Her mother leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know, Avery, children need room to spread their wings. This place is so..." She paused, searching for a polite way to say cramped. "Intimate." Her father nodded sagely. "Perhaps little Tommy could stay with us more often. We have that game room, the big backyard, the pool." Each word felt like a small stab, suggesting I couldn't provide adequately for my own grandson. My daughter-in-law, Ashley, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't defend me. I watched her fidget with her wedding ring, caught between loyalty to her husband's mother and allegiance to her own parents. In that moment, I realized they saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to overcome. I kept my tone calm and measured, agreeing that Tommy should have space to play. Inside, though, my pride was wounded. I had always believed family was about love and connection, not square footage and amenities. After they finally left, my son Leo lingered behind. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was embarrassed or upset. The silence stretched between us as he gathered the courage to speak. "Mum," he said quietly, "I don't agree with them. You know that, right?" His voice carried the same gentle tone he'd used as a boy when he was trying to comfort me after his father's death. I squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from his construction work. "I know, sweetheart. They don't know me like you do." But even as I said it, I felt the sting of their judgment. His in-laws saw me as an outsider, someone to be tolerated rather than embraced. Leo looked around the apartment with different eyes than his in-laws had. He saw the hand-painted border I'd added to the kitchen walls, the bookshelf his father had built, the photographs documenting decades of love and memories. "This place has more warmth than their mansion ever will," he said firmly. His quiet loyalty meant everything to me, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become within my own family. Ashley's parents had made their position clear. I was lacking, inadequate, and possibly a burden. That night, I sat by my small kitchen window, looking out at the building courtyard I'd planted and maintained for 4 decades. The cherry tree my husband and I had planted as newlyweds now towered over the garden beds filled with roses, herbs, and vegetables that I shared with tenants. I thought about the sacrifices my husband and I had made to buy this place. We'd eaten beans and rice for months, worked second jobs, and postponed vacations. We'd painted walls until our backs ached and learned plumbing through trial and error. Every improvement had been earned through sweat and determination. The building represented more than just property. It was our legacy, our security, our contribution to the community. We'd provided affordable housing to families starting out, helped young couples get their first apartments, and created a place where neighbors knew each other's names. Their insults weren't just about my living space. They had disrespected my entire life's work without even knowing it existed. They judged the book by its cover and found it wanting, never bothering to read the chapters that told the real story. I sipped my tea and made a quiet decision. I wouldn't reveal the truth just yet. A week later, I was folding laundry in the hallway when I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone with her mother. Ashley was speaking in hushed tones, but her words carried clearly through the thin walls. "I know, Mum. She lives like a tenant in her own place. It's actually kind of sad," Ashley laughed softly. "Leo keeps defending her, but honestly, I think she's just set in her ways. Poor thing probably can't afford anything bigger." My heart sank as I pressed myself against the wall, clutching a towel to my chest. The casual cruelty in her voice was worse than her parents' obvious disdain. This was my daughter-in-law, the woman my son loved, dismissing me as a charity case. "Maybe we should help her find a nice retirement home," Ashley continued. "Something more suitable for someone her age and circumstances." I stayed frozen until she hung up, then quietly returned to my apartment. The betrayal stung more than I'd expected. Ashley had smiled to my face while plotting my removal from my grandson's life behind my back. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't tell them the truth just yet. I'd let the right moment come naturally, and when it did, it would be all the sweeter. I decided to make some strategic improvements to the building. Nothing too flashy, just subtle upgrades that would remind everyone, including myself, that this was my domain. I hired painters to refresh the hallway walls in a warm cream color and installed better lighting fixtures throughout the common areas. The front garden received special attention. I planted new flower beds with seasonal blooms and added a small seating area where tenants could enjoy their morning coffee. The building's facade got a fresh coat of paint, and I replaced the old mailboxes with elegant brass ones. Every improvement served a dual purpose. First, it increased the property value and made life better for my tenants. Second, it sent a subtle message to anyone paying attention. This wasn't just an apartment building. It was someone's carefully maintained investment. I took special pleasure in the details. The new doormats, the polished brass handrails, the small decorative touches that made the place feel more like home. Each change was a quiet declaration of ownership and pride. My longtime tenants noticed immediately, stopping to thank me in the lobby and commenting on how much they loved living here. Their appreciation warmed my heart and reminded me why I'd chosen this path decades ago. 2 months later, I organized a small tenant gathering in the courtyard. I set up tables with homemade cookies, sandwiches, and fresh lemonade. A local musician friend brought his guitar, and soon the space filled with laughter and conversation. I invited Leo, Ashley, and little Tommy, knowing Ashley would probably bring her parents if they were in town. Sure enough, they arrived fashionably late, looking around the gathering with barely concealed confusion. "What's this for?" Ashley's mother asked, eyeing the decorations suspiciously. "Just a little community get-together," I replied innocently. I thought it would be nice for neighbors to meet each other. They spent the evening assuming I was simply helping out the real landlord, perhaps earning a few dollars for my efforts. Her father even complimented me on my volunteer spirit, as if organizing a party for the building's owner was charity work. I smiled and let them continue thinking whatever made them comfortable. Tommy ran around with the other children, delighted to have playmates in what his great-grandparents considered an inadequate space. The irony was delicious. Here they were, enjoying my hospitality in my courtyard, surrounded by my tenants, still completely clueless about who really owned everything they saw. During the party, Mrs. Henderson from apartment 3B had a bit too much wine. She approached me with tears in her eyes, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Avery, you're the best landlady in the city," she declared, throwing her arms around me. 20 years I've lived here, and you've never raised my rent unfairly. You fixed my heating that same day I called, and when my husband was sick, you brought us soup every day." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Ashley's parents froze mid-conversation, their faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. "Landlady?" Ashley's mother whispered, but then quickly forced a laugh. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson has such an imagination when she's had a few drinks." I noticed the sharp look that passed between Ashley's parents, suspicion creeping into their previously confident assumptions. They weren't entirely convinced it was just drunken rambling, but they weren't ready to accept the alternative either. I simply smiled and helped Mrs. Henderson to a chair, neither confirming nor denying her statement. The seed of doubt had been planted, and I was curious to see how long it would take to grow into full understanding. Rather than explain or clarify, I chose strategic silence. If they were curious enough, they could investigate on their own. And that would make any eventual revelation far more satisfying than simply telling them outright. Over the following weeks, I continued making improvements to the building. New carpet in the hallways, updated fixtures in the lobby, and a fresh coat of paint on the exterior trim. Each enhancement quietly increased the property's value while sending subtle signals to anyone paying attention. I found myself enjoying the game more than I'd expected. There was something delightfully ironic about being underestimated so completely. They thought they knew exactly who I was and what I was worth, never considering that appearances might be deceiving. My tenants appreciated the improvements and often stopped to chat about how much they enjoyed living in the building. Their genuine affection and respect stood in stark contrast to the dismissive attitude I'd received from Ashley's family. I began to understand that this situation was about more than just real estate or money. It was about respect, dignity, and the assumptions people make about others based on superficial observations. They judged me and found me wanting without bothering to learn who I really was. Weeks later, at our regular Sunday family lunch, Ashley's father started asking seemingly casual questions about property prices in this neighborhood. His tone was carefully neutral, but I caught the calculating look in his eyes. "You know, Avery," he said, cutting his roast beef with precision, "real estate values around here seem to be climbing. Have you noticed?" I gave polite, vague answers about how the area had certainly improved over the years. Leo raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in conversation tone, but unsure where it was heading. "I imagine rent prices are going up too," Ashley's mother added delicately. "That must be challenging for people on fixed incomes." The subtle probing continued throughout the meal. They asked about my neighbors, the building's management, and whether I'd ever considered downsizing to something more manageable. Each question felt like a gentle attempt to map the boundaries of my financial situation. I answered with the same pleasant vagueness I'd perfected over decades of teaching curious children. Give enough information to seem cooperative, but never enough to satisfy completely. The game had officially begun, and I was enjoying every minute of it. They were starting to realize they might not know as much about me as they'd assumed. One afternoon, Ashley's parents came by to drop off a birthday gift for Tommy. They arrived just as I was discussing some repair work with a contractor in the building's lobby. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. "Oh, helping out the landlord again?" Ashley's mother asked with that familiar smirk, clearly pleased to have caught me in what she assumed was some kind of charitable work arrangement. Before I could respond, the contractor, a straightforward man who'd been working on my buildings for years, looked confused and replied, "She is the landlord. We're discussing the new flooring for the second floor." The silence that followed was absolutely golden. I watched their faces transform from smug certainty to shocked confusion to uncomfortable realization. Ashley's father's mouth actually opened slightly, like a fish gasping for air. "Oh," Ashley's mother finally managed, her voice considerably smaller than usual. "I see." They didn't ask any follow-up questions, but I could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. Everything they thought they knew about me had just been challenged by an offhand comment from a contractor who assumed everyone already knew the truth. I simply smiled and continued my conversation about tile choices, as if nothing unusual had happened. But I savored every second of their discomfort. After that revealing encounter, their behavior toward me changed noticeably. The casual insults disappeared, replaced by carefully chosen compliments. Suddenly, my curtains were charmingly vintage instead of outdated, and my living room was cozy in such a sophisticated way. Ashley began including me more in conversations about Tommy's activities, asking my opinion on things she'd previously decided unilaterally. Her parents started commenting positively on my cooking, my decorating choices, and even my wise approach to money management. The flattery was transparent and strategic, but I accepted it graciously. I could see them reassessing everything they thought they knew about me, trying to reconcile their assumptions with this new information. During family dinners, they would casually mention their own property investments or financial decisions, clearly hoping I'd share similar information about myself. I remained pleasantly non-committal, which only seemed to increase their curiosity. It was fascinating to watch people recalibrate their entire perception of someone based on a single piece of new information. They weren't being genuine in their sudden respect, but at least the open mockery had stopped. I continued to be polite and welcoming, giving no indication that I'd noticed their dramatic change in attitude. The truth was revealing itself slowly, exactly as I'd hoped. At the next family dinner, Ashley let slip that her parents had been asking around the neighborhood about me. Leo looked up from his plate with interest, asking his wife what she meant by that. Ashley tried to backtrack, claiming her parents were just getting to know the area better, since they visited so often. But her nervous laughter and the way she avoided eye contact told a different story. Asking around about what exactly? Leo pressed, his protective instincts clearly activated. Nothing specific, Ashley said quickly. Just general questions about the neighborhood, property values, that sort of thing. I continued eating my pot roast, hiding my amusement behind a composed expression. The truth was trickling in piece by piece, and they were clearly struggling to process what they were learning. Their casual inquiries among my neighbors had probably yielded some very interesting information. Leo looked between his wife and me, sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. I caught his eye and smiled reassuringly, as if nothing unusual was happening. But inside, I was thoroughly enjoying watching the mystery unfold for them. They'd started this journey of discovery on their own, and I was content to let them continue connecting the dots at their own pace. The following week brought an unexpected invitation. Ashley's parents asked me to lunch at their house for the first time since I'd known them. Their sudden hospitality felt suspicious, but my curiosity was stronger than my caution. Their home was everything mine wasn't: spacious, modern, and obviously expensive. They gave me a tour, pointing out features and renovations with the enthusiasm of people trying to impress. I complimented appropriately, while mentally calculating that my building was worth considerably more than their suburban showcase. Over lunch, Ashley's father steered the conversation toward real estate with all the subtlety of a freight train. "The market's been so volatile lately," he mused. "I imagine managing rental income must be quite complex." "Oh," I replied innocently, "I've found that if you reinvest wisely in your properties, all of them, things tend to work out nicely." The plural didn't escape their notice. Ashley's mother nearly choked on her salad when I mentioned properties rather than property. They exchanged a meaningful look across the table. "Properties?" her father repeated carefully. I smiled and changed the subject to Tommy's upcoming school play, leaving them to wonder exactly how extensive my real estate portfolio might be. The partial revelation was more effective than any boastful declaration could have been. The next week, I received an unexpected phone call from Ashley's mother. She started with pleasant small talk about the weather and Tommy's activities, but I could sense an agenda lurking beneath the surface. "I was just wondering," she said with forced casualness, "if you'd ever considered helping family members get into the property market. You know, sharing your expertise." There it was, the real reason for her call. They were fishing for financial advice, or more likely, financial assistance. I could practically hear the gears grinding in her head as she tried to frame her request delicately. "Oh, that's very flattering," I replied, matching her casual tone. "But I've found it's best to keep business and family relationships separate. It can get so complicated otherwise." She pressed a bit more, mentioning some opportunities they'd been considering, but I remained politely non-committal. When she finally gave up and ended the call, I sat back in my chair with deep satisfaction. They were clearly beginning to understand that I had money, but they still didn't grasp the full scope of my situation. More importantly, they were starting to see me as a potential resource rather than a burden. The transformation was remarkable to witness. 2 weeks later, Ashley's parents invited me out for coffee at an upscale cafe downtown. Just the three of us. No Leo, no Ashley, no Tommy to distract from whatever they had in mind. After the usual pleasantries about the weather and family, they got down to business. They'd found a wonderful investment opportunity. A small apartment complex that was being sold below market value due to the owner's urgent need to relocate. "We thought," Ashley's father said carefully, "that someone with your experience in real estate might be interested in partnering with us on this purchase." I listened politely as they outlined their proposal. They'd handle the management and renovations while I provided the majority of the financing. The potential returns, they assured me, would be excellent for all parties involved. When they finished their pitch, I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. "I appreciate you thinking of me," I said calmly, "but I don't invest with people I can't trust." The silence that followed was absolutely delicious. They sat frozen, unsure whether I was joking or serious. The disappointment in their eyes told me everything I needed to know about their motivations. I finished my coffee and politely excused myself, leaving them to contemplate what I'd meant. The next family dinner was painfully awkward. Ashley's parents barely spoke to me, responding to my attempts at conversation with clipped, polite answers. They were clearly embarrassed and possibly angry about my rejection of their investment proposal. Leo noticed the tension immediately. He kept glancing between his in-laws and me, trying to understand what had changed since our last gathering. Ashley looked uncomfortable, caught between her husband's obvious confusion and her parents' wounded pride. Little Tommy, oblivious to the adult tensions, chattered happily about his school project on community helpers. He'd chosen to write about Grandma Avery because, as he put it, she takes care of everyone in her building. The innocent comment hung in the air like another small revelation. Ashley's parents shifted, uncomfortably, probably wondering exactly what Tommy knew about my role in the building that they'd dismissed as inadequate. I deflected Leo's questions about the obvious tension, not wanting to create a permanent rift in his marriage. But I could see him filing away details, his protective instincts clearly activated by the strange atmosphere. The evening ended earlier than usual, with Ashley's parents making excuses about an early morning appointment. The game was becoming less fun for them as they realized I held all the cards. Over the following weeks, Ashley's parents' phone calls became more frequent and increasingly desperate. Each conversation started with friendly small talk, but inevitably circled back to their financial situation, though they tried hard to disguise their growing panic. "Property taxes are just so unpredictable these days," Ashley's mother would sigh during our conversations. "We never know what unexpected expenses might come up." Her father was slightly more direct, mentioning cash flow challenges and temporary liquidity issues that successful people sometimes faced. They painted their problems as minor setbacks that any savvy investor would understand. But I could read between the lines. Their investment in the vacation property had probably stretched them thin, and the economic downturn had likely affected whatever business ventures they'd been counting on. They needed money, and they needed it badly. Each call ended with some variation of, "We were wondering if you might consider," followed by an increasingly creative request for financial assistance. I listened politely, but never committed to anything. Eventually, I stopped answering their calls altogether. If they had something important to discuss, they could speak to me in person at family gatherings. The phone calls had become too transparent in their desperation. One Sunday afternoon, Ashley's parents arrived at my apartment unannounced. They looked haggard and anxious, very different from the confident people who'd mocked my living space months earlier. "Avery, we need to talk," Ashley's father said without preamble. Gone was any pretense of social niceties or casual conversation. They sat heavily on my old sofa, the same one they'd looked at with disdain during their first visit, and laid out their situation. They were in serious financial trouble. Bad investments, unexpected medical bills, and declining business had left them facing possible bankruptcy. "We know we haven't always." Ashley's mother struggled with the words. "We may have been unfair in our assessment of your situation." They were asking for a substantial loan, enough to save their house and their business. They promised to pay interest, to sign legal documents, to do whatever I required. Their desperation was palpable, and frankly, a little sad to witness. I looked at them sitting in my cozy living room, finally seeing me as I really was, instead of what they'd assumed. But their recognition had come too late, and for entirely the wrong reasons. "I'm sorry," I said calmly, "but I don't lend money to people who belittle me in my own home." Ashley confronted me the next day, arriving at my apartment with fury radiating from every pore. She accused me of turning my back on family when they needed help most, conveniently forgetting how her family had treated me from day one. "They made a mistake," she said, pacing around my living room like a caged animal. "People say things they don't mean when they're trying to make conversation. You're holding a grudge over nothing." I remained seated in my armchair, watching her work herself into an increasingly agitated state. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke quietly but firmly. "Ashley, I clearly remember your mother saying their pantry was bigger than my entire home. I remember your father suggesting Tommy would be better off staying with them because I couldn't provide adequately, and I especially remember you laughing along with them." Her face flushed as she realized I'd heard and remembered every slight, every casual cruelty they'd thought was harmless entertainment. "But that was before we knew," she started. "Before you knew I had money?" I interrupted. "That's exactly my point. Your respect shouldn't depend on my bank account." Leo arrived just as Ashley was winding up for another angry speech. One look at his wife's face and my calm demeanor told him everything he needed to know about who was being reasonable in this argument. A week later, a long letter arrived in my mailbox. Ashley's parents had written what amounted to a formal apology, filled with flowery language about misunderstandings and family bonds that should transcend minor disagreements. They acknowledged that they'd made assumptions about my circumstances and admitted these assumptions had colored their behavior toward me. They spoke about how much they'd come to respect my wisdom and business acumen since learning about my property investments. The letter concluded with another request for financial assistance, framed as an opportunity for me to help family members get back on their feet. They promised to be grateful, respectful, and worthy of my trust if I would just give them one chance to make things right. I read the letter twice, then set it aside without responding. The apology felt calculated rather than genuine, motivated by desperation rather than true remorse. They weren't sorry for how they'd treated me. They were sorry they'd misjudged my ability to help them. Their words about family bonds rang especially hollow. Where had those bonds been when they were mocking my home and suggesting I was inadequate to care for my own grandson? Family loyalty, apparently, was a one-way street that ran toward their bank account. After a week of silence, I decided to end the uncertainty once and for all. I called Ashley's parents directly, thanking them for their letter and acknowledging their apology. "I'm glad you've recognized that your initial assessment of my situation was incorrect," I said calmly. "And I appreciate that you've apologized for your behavior during that first visit." I could hear hope creeping into their voices as they started to respond, probably thinking my call meant I'd reconsidered their request for help. "However," I continued, "I've decided that I will not be in regular contact with you going forward. I wish you well with your financial difficulties, but I think it's best if we maintain our distance." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. They'd expected either yes or no to their loan request, not a complete severing of relationship. You're not welcome to visit my home or call me, I added firmly. If there are family events where we'll both be present, I'll be polite for Leo and Tommy's sake, but that's the extent of our relationship. I hung up before they could respond, feeling lighter than I had in months. Sometimes the best solution to a toxic relationship is simply to end it. In the months that followed, I focused on maintaining the relationships that truly mattered. Leo and Tommy visited often, and we fell into comfortable routines of Sunday dinners and Saturday morning adventures in the city. My relationship with Ashley remained civil but distant. She'd clearly been hurt by my refusal to help her parents, but she also seemed to understand that their behavior had created the situation. For Leo's sake, we maintained a polite facade that allowed family gatherings to proceed without drama. The tension was never entirely absent, but it was manageable. Ashley occasionally made pointed comments about family loyalty or forgiveness, but Leo had apparently talked to her about letting the subject drop. Tommy, blessedly unaware of the adult complications, continued to love spending time at my cozy apartment. He'd help me water the courtyard plants and check on the building's maintenance needs, proud to be my assistant in caring for our castle, as he called it. The peace in my life was worth every boundary I'd established. I'd learned that sometimes protecting your own dignity requires disappointing people who feel entitled to your resources. It was a hard lesson, but an important one. Today, I'm sitting in my courtyard, sipping tea and watching the sun filter through the leaves of the cherry tree my husband and I planted 4 decades ago. The building around me hums with the quiet activity of families going about their daily lives. My tenants, my community, my legacy. I think about that day when Ashley's parents first mocked my small apartment, measuring my worth by square footage and finding it lacking. They'd seen cramped spaces where I saw home. They'd seen inadequacy where I saw contentment. The irony still makes me smile. They'd spent that entire visit looking down on me, literally and figuratively, never realizing they were guests in a building I owned entirely. Every brick, every board, every inch of the property they'd dismissed as insufficient belonged to me. Their assumptions had revealed more about them than about me. They'd equated worth with visible wealth, respect with financial status, and family love with material advantage. In losing their respect for a version of me that never existed, they'd lost access to the person I actually was. Now, as I plan improvements for next year and review applications from potential new tenants, I'm grateful for the lesson they taught me about the importance of seeing people clearly. Appearances, I learned, can be not just deceiving, but completely irrelevant to what really matters. The building stands strong around me, filled with families who see me as I truly am, not because of what I own, but because of who I choose to be.